Lies of P is the only game that gets to be called a Souls-like ever again. Lords of the Fallen? Nope, that's not Souls-like anymore. Hollow Knights? No, not a chance, buddy. Neo? Not even close. Lies of P gets crowned King of Souls-like games because, unlike most other Souls-like games, which will try to follow the Dark Souls formula, but then they add a bunch of their own shitty ideas into the game that make it suck, almost every single thing that exists within Lies of P is either directly or indirectly taken from another Fromsoft game. Of course, you got basic normal things like the bonfires, the Estus Flask, and the money and XP being the same thing, and then you lose them when you die, and go back to the bonfire, get your Estus back. But then, if you get down into like the dirty, nasty, stink-ass underside of the game, and you realize that the boss designs and the areas, the weapons, and just like little things like attack animations and enemy placement, they're all taken from Souls, Eldenring, Bloodborne, Sekiro, and even Armored Core. And the issue with them taking so much from so many different places is that when people bought the game, they expected to get Bloodborne on the PC, but what everybody got instead was every single Fromsoft game from the last 12 years blended together in the Vitamix and then poured into a cup that said Bloodborne 2 on it. Like Lies of P has crystal lizards that are actually butterflies. They do all the same shit as crystal lizards. They run away from you and they disappear if you don't get them fast enough, and they drop upgrade materials.
Jeepers. Is that a butterfly?
It has these small side quests that people can tell you through windows, and they all end in tragedy, just like the side quests in the windows of Yharnam and Bloodborne. There are other hunters who are called stalkers, and they've gone crazy, and you have to kill them, just like in Bloodborne. There's Dark Beast Parl. There's an upgrade system similar to the one in Sekiro for your P organs. Also, speaking of Sekiro, you get this little prosthetic hand with different types of tools that you can use. Additionally, the main mechanic for defending yourself is essentially the same as the guarding system in Sekiro. With the same unblockable red flash attacks that enemies can do. This enemy here, it looks a lot like this 2-shield enemy from Dark Souls 2. There's this fireball that rolls down the hall and kills anything in its way. You know, like Incense Fortress. They took this alarm sound from the iPhone, which isn't a Dark Souls game, but you know what I mean. The ground breaks underneath you all the time, just everywhere. Every single bridge you go on, it breaks. They've got Anor Londo. There's this guy that you encounter in like a cutscene before the actual boss fight. This guy is called the One-Winged Angel, that's from a different game entirely. But he actually just looks like the Covetous Demon. So kind of going two different directions there, but still not helping their case for things getting copied. There's this really annoying platforming section that I died like 20 times on. There's this arrow trap that if you step on a platform, you get shot from the wall. These slops, they fall on you from the ceiling, just like the slops that fall on you in the ceiling in the depths in Dark Souls 1. There's a furry, and he's friendly.
You don't know who I am. Preposterous!
There's this elevator that you jump off early to get an item. There's another platforming section, but you're going down this time. There's Red Lobster, which isn't from a Dark Souls game, but, you know, that's from real life. I've been there. They've got this shitty, dilapidated old village where everyone is a monster. These dogs, they break out of their cages, just like in Bloodborne. This enemy specifically has this little down-up swing attack that's literally the same as the enemies in Bloodborne. They've got this guy who fucks a puppet.
Maybe I'm crazy, though. Whoever heard of a human and a puppet in love?
Yeah, Gehrman bangs that thing. He says he does. He says it in the beginning of the game.
Should it please you?
There's Deathblight from Eldenring. That's fun. There's this big ballista that shoots you in the swamp, just like in Dark Souls 3. And speaking of the swamp, there's a poison swamp, obviously. They've got Blight Town. There's a boss that you fight at the beginning of the game as like a tutorial boss, and then he returns near the end of the game, but he's like way faster and more dangerous, just like in Dark Souls 3. The furry betrays you later in the game. They've got the Ring and City DLC from Dark Souls 3. There's these really long ladders. There's these really long elevators. Like, seriously, this one takes 35 seconds to go up and down. Oh my god. They've got the Dark Souls placement of an enemy behind a corner, so it jumps out at you when you try to walk past. There's a cute kitty. This guy's name is literally Manus. Like,
Simon Manus.
and there's also this secret ending that you can get, but you have to jump through a bunch of hoops to get through it, just like every Fromsoft game. But this isn't to say that the game is bad. Lies of P is actually very good, and absolutely the most fun Souls-like that I've ever played. It's possibly even a better Souls game than the ugly middle child of the Dark Souls series. However, it's pretty blatantly obvious that anytime the game is not really pulling from other FromSoft games, that the developers were a little bit confused about what direction the game was going in. And there isn't really anything wrong with borrowing mechanics or things that your developer team enjoys from other games, but when the similarities are this noticeable and prevalent through nearly the entire game, it's not really an amazing look for the first action RPG of this dev team, despite the fact that it's really fun. But what makes it so enjoyable in the first place? Well, essentially that everything that makes Dark Souls games enjoyable. It has fast-paced action, and the game is relatively difficult, which will give Souls veterans like one more thing to feel high and mighty about when they brag to their Discord about how fast they beat the game. It also has stunning areas and beautiful music, and every Souls fan's favorite, women's feet. Most of the bosses in the game can be seen with fairly unique movesets and designs, but it's easy to feel like the influence that games like Eldenring and Sekiro had on the bosses' attack pattern designs, because many of the bosses, especially endgame bosses like Laxasia and the Nameless Puppet, they really feel like they could have been pulled straight from Eldenring, with their movesets being very fast, very aggressive, and not really giving the player much time to get hits in at all. That is, of course, if this was a Souls game, you wouldn't have much time. But this is Lies of P. The melding together of the rally system from Bloodborne and the perfect guard and posture breaking system from Sekiro makes for a playstyle that really allows you to quickly block these attacks, go for the perfect guards, and gets hits in to recover the lost health whenever your perfect guard is successful. And the health recovery system that all the bosses and enemies in the game have forces you to play as aggressively as possible without getting yourself sentenced to smash to death in 1 second. But despite the many similarities of all the Souls games and Lies of P, the combat system is much more specialized to this game, to where if you attempt to actually play the game like you would play Dark Souls or Elden Ring by dodging the boss's hits and trying to get hits in when they're in recovery, you'll never actually be able to beat any bosses within a reasonable amount of time. However, this fact brings us to the biggest issue with Lies of P, the fact that through 90% of the game, you don't actually have to learn how to play it. Let's raise a hypothetical here. Suppose we have two people who just purchased Lies of P. We've got player A and player B. Both player A and B have played Souls games in the past, so they know most of the ins and outs of action RPG combat in that way. The key difference between the two of them is that player A wants to win the game with anything that the game will give them and just plays it like a regular Souls game, and player B wants to challenge themselves to beat everything with just their weapon and some game knowledge. Which one of these players do you think is going to have a more difficult time with the game, and which one do you think is going to enjoy it more? I'll give you like a second to think about it. If you answered that player B is going to have a more difficult time and player A is going to have more fun, then you're absolutely wrong, you idiot. Let's walk through the game together and I'll show you what I mean. Starting with our very first boss, the Parade Master, this is like our intro boss. This is the boss that's going to shape the playthroughs of player A and B. Player B will lose to this boss several times before understanding the attack patterns and how their guard and perfect guard work together to keep their health topped up while also doing consistent damage. Player A, however, bought 3 throwing cells from the vendor and picked up 3 thermites in the alleyway and is able to just steamroll the boss by throwing bottles at it, not really learning the attack patterns or how the guards and perfect guards need to be used, and this pattern will just continue through the game. The game's going to attempt to teach our players about these mechanics throughout the game, but unfortunately most of the areas in Lies of P that don't include mini-bosses are about as easy to get through as solving the children's maze on the back of a placemat at Denny's. You stun lock an enemy, you move to the next, you stun lock that enemy, and just over and over and over like that. When we have to fight our first and potentially only stalker boss, the Mad Donkey, Player B is going to use a mix of what they learned in the Parade Master fight and with the other smaller enemies, and doesn't really have a hard time with the Mad Donkey due to how slow the attacks are, but Player A is going to have a more difficult time since they really haven't gotten the same experience as Player B, and will more than likely resort to just attempting to backstab the Mad Donkey over and over, which will work, but it takes a while and it's not really fun. And that pattern of takes a while and not very fun will be very pervasive throughout Player A's playthrough. We move on to our next boss, the Scrapped Watchman, and this is the first boss that allows us to summon a specter into the fight, and giving our players the option to summon someone sets a precedent for being able to summon for basically every single boss in the future. Our dear sweet Player A summons the Spectre and proceeds to just destroy the Watchman with like no difficulty, because the Watchman is only going to be able to handle attacking one person at a time. Player A isn't going to learn the patterns, doesn't really learn how the electric shock on the ground works, and more than likely doesn't even experience or really understand the electric shock status effect, which the game is really attempting to teach them from this boss. Player B doesn't summon, and learns all the attack patterns of the Watchman, realizes that the shock will transfer into the ground and then do AoE damage a second later, and gets shocked so many times that they realize that their Fable gets decayed while being affected by it. Player B will probably spend a good hour or so figuring out how to time all the attacks correctly, and eventually will get the Watchman killed. But Player A's game ability to beat the boss seems to be on par with Player B's, but Player B has much more experience with the actual combat system, and that will affect our two players very differently as the game goes on. Next area that we move on to is called Vagini Works, which is where we can kind of watch the difference in fun and skill between our two players start to become more readily apparent. Player A will face some mini-bosses that are just absolutely devastating to their current playstyle, and will more than likely either take several attempts to take out these shovel-wielding puppets, or just run past them and continue to not learn anything about how to take care of enemies that don't stagger like the small enemies do. But Player B is going to easily take them out since they're not really that hard to just block and attack over and over. If only Player A knew that, but unfortunately they're stupid, and the game doesn't really push you to learn how to do it. Moving on to our boss of the area, which is King's Flame Fuoco. This is where we'll see a huge difference in Player A and B, where Player A will summon for the fight and attempt to do what they've been doing the entire time, which is just attacking the boss from the back where it can't get to them. But Fuoco is just a little bit different from the other boss that we've seen so far, where it has these spinning attacks that hit in every direction, and even has hitboxes on the back of its body during these unblockable charge attacks. This, along with the entire area filling with fire and the dashing projectile attacks, will make everything that Player A attempts to do much more difficult. And Player A is going to suffer through this fight, and probably will even think that the boss is poorly designed by the standards that the game has set so far. But eventually, after a slog of time, Player A is going to beat the boss, even though it's going to just take a really long time and isn't going to be very fun. Player B, on the other hand, who knows how to actually block and attack correctly, will have a very fun time learning this boss's patterns and knowing what to block and what to perfect guard. Our next boss, the One-Winged Angel, features a moveset that will make Player A just as frustrated as the last boss, where there are attacks that will hit from all sides or hit from behind. And here's where I realized that if the developers of Lies of P would have continued to make the boss movesets to be like Fuoco and the One-Winged Angel, and continue to make it also difficult to win with the Spectre, or at least, make the players need to learn the movesets enough to learn how to block, perfect guard, or dodge at the right times, then the game would overall be better for it. There are several mini-bosses in the Malum District, which is our next area that we're exploring, that will be really incredibly difficult for Player A, but not very hard for Player B. However, just like every challenge for Player A so far, they can be circumvented, this time by just running away. This pattern of incredibly difficult challenges that can be learned and overcome, but don't necessarily need to be to continue forward, is repeated through the game just over and over and over, so Player A never really has to learn anything. When we run into our boss of the area, the Black Rabbit Brotherhood, Player A is going to reach a little bit of a snag, since you can let the Spectre take the aggro from the main boss, but you'll still get rushed down and killed by the other members of the family, and the Spectre is going to die really quickly, as the eldest brother dishes out an insane amount of damage. However, in the Red Lobster Inn, remember the Red Lobster that we talked about earlier? There's a merchant who sells these throwing items, and this merchant, along with the Spectre, are going to carry our Player A through every single other fight the game has to offer. The next big challenge would be the Mad Clown Puppet in Rosa Isabelle Street, but he can just be ran past, you don't even have to fight him. And then the boss of the area, the King of Puppets, would be hard as well, but the Spectre can take aggro while you just throw projectiles at him. So he's just circumvented like every other boss so far. Our next boss is Victor. He could be taken out the same way with projectiles and the Spectre, and the same with the green monster of the swamp. They don't pose a challenge with player A's method of summoning a Spectre and then throwing projectiles at the enemy. But then we get to the Walker of Illusions. If Fuoko and the One-Winged Angel were speed bumps in the road to beating the game for player A, then the Walker of Illusions is a roadblock set up by the developer to police to catch bad players in their tracks. This boss is just not cheesable like the last 5 bosses we've encountered, because player A can't summon a Spectre, and they can't just run past them like they have for the last past difficult bosses that they couldn't summon for. This boss is straight up evil for player A, with attacks that require perfect guards to not get hurt by, aka that you can't dodge them because they instantly snap to you. There's large AoEs that prevent you from getting critical attacks on them when their health bar turns white, and they summon a second boss to fight you in the middle of the fight. And if it weren't for the fact that you only have to do half or so of their health bar before being able to whittle them down the rest of the way with projectiles, then player A probably wouldn't be able to get past it until learning how to actually play the game. But thankfully for our player A, it's possible to still win against this boss without resorting to learning. Player B, on the other hand, will be able to take down this boss in only a couple of tries. Our next 2 bosses that we have are the Corrupted Parade Puppet, which is just like the first boss of the game and can be killed with projectiles just the same, and we move on to the rematch with the Black Rabbit Brotherhood. This fight is set up like a traditional gank fight, but the main difference is that even though there are 3 bosses in the arena, really only 1 at a time are going to try to attack you, meaning that player A can still just summon and beat them while not really putting themselves in any real danger. Then, into our final leg of the game, we have the Door Guardian, which you cannot summon for and cannot cheese with projectiles, which seems like the end of the line for player A, but this boss is honestly so badly designed and so boring and slow and easy that it really doesn't take long to take him down for players A or B. All you have to do is hit his one leg and then dodge out of the way until he's ready to be critical attacked. The next part of the game is, for me, the absolute worst area that it has to offer, the Arch Abbey. This place is like if the devil and Satan and Beelzebub and Mephistopheles and Lucifer all came together to make an area that I hate more than anything in any Souls or Souls-like game ever. But that's not what this video is about. If I was going to list every small detail about this game that I liked or disliked, I would also have to get into the plot of the game, and the subplot, and the sub-subplot.
Are you a puppet? Or a human being?
And this would turn into some 6-hour-long Joseph Anderson type video, and I'm just not going to do it. We move on to our third to last boss, Laxasia. Again, this boss's design philosophy remains the same. You're able to summon a Spectre and let them take the brunt of the damage from Laxasia while you attack her from behind. However, this is the second boss we've seen since the One-Winged Angel that actually attempts to stop you from doing this, as Laxasia is equipped with a shield on her back that makes it slightly harder to just wail on her from behind, at least in her first phase, because your attacks will kind of bounce off of her as you attempt to do it. Later on in the first phase, you can break the shield if you hit it enough times, which kind of makes the remainder of the fight easy. And another thing that the devs did right in this fight is giving Laxasia huge damage outputs to make up for the fact that she'll aggro onto the Spectre, to hopefully kill it before she dies. But then, to counter that, the developers also added this Wish Stone that you can use to buff up your Spectre so it isn't taking all that damage. Again, in this fight, player A will learn basically nothing, while also having a really hard time dodging all the attacks to throw bottles of garbage at this giant woman. Player B, however, already has the experience of fighting fast opponents and finding small openings for damage and will fold Laxasia in several attempts. Our second to last boss here is Simon Manus, who we saw earlier in the game, but now he's Resident Evil'd himself into a big blue blob monster, and honestly, this is one of the easier fights in the game. Player A can pretty much easily take this boss down, just like a normal Dark Souls boss, dodging attacks and hitting during the downed animations. And this boss kind of functions like the Dark Souls terrible final boss that occurs in a lot of Dark Souls games like Gwyn, Nishandra, Moon Presence, Elden Beast. And he even has similar attacks to Elden Beast with this golden attack that looks a lot like Elden Stars. Either way, player A is not going to have a hard time, especially with the Spectre and projectiles, and player B isn't going to have a hard time either. Then we have our final, and technically optional, boss, and this is where, my dear naive viewers, I have a confession to make.
I'm disappointed in you.
The player A and player B hypothetical, it wasn't a hypothetical, it was real all along. I am both players A and B. That's right, my first playthrough of Lies of P, I barely learned how to play the game, and I was punished for it. Not by not being able to beat the game, no, I was punished by something far, far worse. I was punished by not having a very fun time. My first playthrough of Lies of P, I played it like any old Dark Souls game, trying and failing over and over to just dodge attacks while summoning the Spectre and using everything at my advantage because I stupidly thought that that was how the game was designed to be played. Until I fought the final boss, the Nameless Puppet. This boss is super fast, super aggressive, has a ton of health, does a ton of damage, and has so little cooldown between attacks, it honestly feels like you're fighting a boss that's supposed to be in Sekiro. And the real, kicker of this boss is you can't summon a Spectre, and this boss just has too much health and is too fast to be cheesed with projectiles. And this is the first time in the game where I was completely unable to beat a boss due to the fact that I simply hadn't been learning how to actually play during the entire first playthrough. And this is a really big point of contention that I have for Lies of P. I wasn't forced to learn how to actually fight the bosses until I had progressed so far into the game that the final boss was too much of a challenge for me. And instead of spending hours and hours on this boss, which I tried, I did do that, and I failed, I could barely get past the first phase. I just gave up. I gave Geppetto my heart, I got the bad ending of the game. Alright chat, we're gonna give up, because I don't want to do this game anymore. But the beauty of it there is that I was player A for my first playthrough. But for my second playthrough, I was player B. I beat every boss the way that Miyazaki intended, and I got the secret ending too. And not only was it easier than my first playthrough, it took me less time, and I had much, much more fun doing it. Even the Nameless Puppet, who was, I will admit, very hard, was an enjoyable fight right down until the very final attempt. And this is where I think Lies of P needs the absolute most improvement, and I hope it's something that they improve upon in the DLC. And while I really did enjoy my time playing, I think the fact that during my playthrough, I barely had to learn anything about how the game functions to finish it is indicative of larger issues in the development process. I really honestly wish that earlier in the game there was a point where you weren't able to move forward without actually legitimately learning how to use the block and rally system in tandem with the perfect guard system to kill a boss. And the game seems to try to do it by giving bosses that will not fully focus on the Spectre during the fight and will attempt to attack you both and the Spectre at the same time, like the One-Winged Angel and the Black Rabbit Brotherhood. But the amount of options that are given to you during the fights against these enemies, to take them down without learning the system, completely nullifies what the devs are trying to do there. And the fact that it feels like they just gave up on that style of boss after a few tries, and the bosses just go back to completely focusing on your summoned Spectre during the fight, really shows that they may not have had the foresight that someone would be able to get through these bosses without learning. But there's always a possibility that I'm wrong, and the developers are actually Gigabrain 4D developers that wanted me to play through the game twice. Who knows? Hi there. If you liked this video, consider liking and subscribing. This is my first long-form video that I've made, and I'm hoping that I can make more in the future, because it was a lot of fun to make this and write the script and record it. Anyway, thank you so much for watching.